Hello everyone, welcome to Best Recipes with Sharon. Today we will be making oatmeal date cookies, the old-fashioned style. These have been a family favorite for years. It's my mother's recipe, and she would do it mostly from memory. So here I do my best to capture the amounts, and I'll pass that along to you. We'll start by pre-pouring. This is some sour cream that you will need, and then you'll need some oatmeal, and you'll need some baking soda, and you put that baking soda into the sour cream. And then you will need to preload some margarine, some brown sugar, and even a little bit of salt. You need just enough flour so that the dough can be rolled, so about a cup to start with. So let's get right to doing the recipe amounts. Add 3/4 of a cup of margarine to a large mixing bowl. Now 1½ cups of brown sugar. Then 4 tablespoons of sour cream, which has had 1 teaspoon of soda added to it ahead of time when you did your pre-mixing. Next, add 2 cups of quick cooking oats. Then add ½ teaspoon of salt. Then mix that together until it's really well combined. And this is where the recipe says to add enough flour to roll. But I start with about 1 cup of flour and mix that in really well. This will allow the dough to stick together enough that you can put it out onto a floured board and begin to roll. And you will be using lots of flour to roll this out. So make sure that the board that you're rolling it on or the countertop has lots of flour underneath, and that you definitely flour your rolling pin before rolling it out. And you'll need to dust with flour several times throughout the rolling process in order to keep the rolling pin from sticking to the dough. And you'll notice that it also comes off the counter easier when you've used a fair little bit of flour underneath. Cut them into whatever shapes you desire. It's easier if you use simple shapes like squares or circles. And here I'm starting with the squares, and I'm using my spatula to remove it off the countertop and place it onto the cookie sheet. I find it works quite well because the spatula is so flexible. And I will have preheated my oven to 350 degrees. And of course these cookies are on parchment paper, and I'll put them in the oven about 8 minutes. And while they're in there, I'll continue rolling out the rest of my dough and doing some more shapes. And always put similar shapes on the same cookie sheet so that they'll bake evenly. And when you're rolling it out, make sure to flour your board generously and to often flour your rolling pin as well. And don't forget to set your timer when you have them in the oven. Now to make the date filling, place a medium saucepan on the stove. And I'm using pitted dates here. I have a bar that I'm just going to chop in half, and then I'm going to cut it into smaller pieces. Enough to make about 1 cup. And it's just a little easier to measure. It doesn't matter what size they are because we're going to mash them anyways. And then place the dates in the saucepan. And I use a large spoon just to spread them out a little bit. And dates are pretty sweet just on their own, but I do think that they need just a little bit of brown sugar, so I add 1/8 cup of brown sugar. Add just enough water to cover the dates. Then turn your heat on high and get this to come to a full rolling boil. Then turn it down and simmer it. Stir it quite frequently until it thickens nicely. And it is starting to thicken a little bit, but it's not quite there yet. Don't forget your cookies in the oven. Make sure that you check them when the timer goes, and they may take between 8 and 9 minutes. But when they're ready, remove them from the oven, and they should be lightly golden brown. Then I take a potato masher and I mash the dates to make them into a paste. And this will thicken it up so that it'll be more spreadable. As this cools off, it will thicken even more. And then I just add a hint of vanilla, about a ½ teaspoon. And stir that in and set the date mixture aside to cool. Then I take my cookies and remove them from the cookie sheet while they're still hot. And as you can see, the bottom of the cookie is browned nicely. You want them just lightly browned, try not to overbake. And they are a little bit of a stiff cookie to start with, but that's just perfect for the type of cookie that we need it to be because the date filling will soften it up a little bit. Now the leftover pieces of dough I've rolled out, and I'm making other shapes with that. And every time you roll the dough again, it does get a little more stiff and a little bit harder to work with. So that's why you use a little bit of flour at a time. And if you need to, you can add just a little bit of water if it needs to have a little bit, if it's getting too stiff to roll it. Then I take the date mixture and I put it into a dish. It helps to cool it off a little bit faster. And now that it's cooled down a little bit, you can see that it has thickened up even more. It's still a little bit lukewarm, but it's okay to go ahead and use it. And even if the cookies are lukewarm, you can still start. And the last bit of cookies have just come out of the oven. So I'll remove them from the cookie sheet and let them cool. But I can start putting some of the first cookies together because they've cooled down enough. Now I'm doing this consecutively and I'm doing a lot of multitasking. You don't have to do it that quickly. If you have other things going on, you can set it aside and come back to it. I've dedicated the time to it for the sake of the video, and so I'm just making best use of my time. So while they were baking, I was making the actual filling for the middle. And so I pair them up so that they have a top and a bottom. And I put a good rounded teaspoonful of the date mixture on my cookies, and then place a top on it and gently press down on it so that it distributes evenly out to the edges. The more complicated the cookie cutter, the more difficult it is to make sure that the edges match up when you put the top on it. But hey, it can be done. It works quite nicely here. But the more simple the shape, like even this heart shape, is easy to put together. And both oatmeal and dates are really good for you. So these cookies have a lot of fiber, and they're an energy-rich snack that helps keep you full and satisfied. But most of all, they taste really good. And this recipe makes up to 2 dozen cookies. And if you wanted to make them ahead and freeze them, they freeze really well too. So treasure this recipe and enjoy. Until next time, happy eating.